Politécnica de Valencia, en sesión celebrada el día 26 de febrero de 1998, presidida por el excelentísimo señor rector magnífico don Justo Nieto, a instancia del Departamento de Termodinámica Aplicada y en reconocimiento a sus méritos, adoptó el acuerdo de nombrar doctor honoris causa por la Universidad Politécnica de Valencia al excelentísimo señor don Rudolf Marcus, de lo que yo, Concepción Maroto Álvarez, como secretaria general de la Universidad Politécnica de Valencia, con el visto bueno del excelentísimo y magnífico señor rector, doy fe en Valencia a 22 de junio de 1999.
El profesor Dr. Vitali Barkulik tiene la palabra para presentar al excelentísimo señor don Rudolf Marcus.
Muy honorable señor, excelentísimo y magnífico rector de la Universidad Politécnica, ilustrísimas señoras directora general y señora consejera, excelentísimos y ilustrísimos señores, señoras claustrales, señoras y señores. Tengo el enorme honor y placer de ser el padrino de honorable señor Rudolf Marcus, profesor honorífico del California Institute of Technology, Pasadena. Me siento muy orgulloso porque nuestra universidad consideró oportuno aceptar la propuesta del Departamento de Termodinámica Aplicada, del que yo formo parte, de investir al profesor Marcus como doctor honoris causa de la Universidad Politécnica de Valencia. Tiene 15 doctorados honoríficos por parte de universidades distinguidas norteamericanas y europeas. Y por fin llega el momento de obtener un título por parte de una universidad española, la nuestra. El profesor Rudolf Marcus es un científico de reconocido prestigio a nivel mundial que desarrolla sus investigaciones en el campo de la teoría de reacciones químicas por transferencias de carga eléctrica. Sus trabajos han sido claves para entender mejor y empezar a utilizar los procesos tan fundamentales para la ciencia y tan importantes para la práctica como la transformación de energía solar por plantas, producción fotoquímica de combustibles fósiles, quimoluminiscencia, conducción eléctrica en polímeros conductores, corrosión de metales, y etc. Se puede decir sin ninguna exageración que sus investigaciones han cambiado la metodología del trabajo en química, física, biología y otras ciencias. En los años 50 despertaron mucho interés y empezaron a estudiarse de cerca las reacciones de oxidación y reducción en las moléculas orgánicas e inorgánicas complejas. Estas reacciones tienen lugar cuando una molécula obtiene uno o varios electrones de otra molécula. Se vio que algunos de estos procesos transcurrían muy lentamente, cosa que no tenía explicación razonable. El profesor Marcus fue el primero en desarrollar una teoría que permitía explicar estos datos experimentales confusos y controvertidos. Desarrolló un algoritmo teórico que permitió calcular y explicar las reacciones químicas que transcurren con transferencia de carga eléctrica entre moléculas. Así, muchos fenómenos que no habían sido comprendidos hasta entonces obtuvieron su explicación. Tengo que resaltar que esta teoría tenía carácter revolucionario, ya que sus predicciones iban en contra de lo que se esperaba según las teorías químicas tradicionales. Han pasado casi 30 años hasta que se pudo obtener la confirmación experimental definitiva de sus predicciones. Durante los años 50 y 60, el profesor Marcus publicó una serie de trabajos desarrollando su teoría. Supuso en ella dos postulados básicos: que las moléculas que toman parte en la reacción han de tener una interacción débil entre sí, y las que no participan en la reacción también influyen en ella indirectamente, moviéndose a través de la solución y cambiando el valor de barrera enérgica. El profesor Marcus encontró una fórmula matemática que permitía calcular esa barrera en función de las propiedades de las moléculas que entran en la reacción. La teoría predecía que la velocidad de la reacción disminuye cuando su energía libre aumenta y no al revés, como pensaban los químicos en aquel tiempo. Apareció el término zona de energías invertida, o inverted region en inglés. los químicos de los 60 no tenían medios para comprobar la predicción y hubo que esperar hasta los 80 cuando por fin llegaron resultados experimentales que confirmaron la teoría. Muy pronto después, en el año de 1992, el profesor Marcus fue galardonado con el Premio Nobel en Química. Hoy tenemos la posibilidad de oír esa historia a través de la boca de su protagonista. Por mi parte, para presentar al profesor Marcus, prefiero hablar de cosas menos oficiales como mis sentimientos personales o estos detalles pequeños que quizá no se encuentran en la biografía oficial, pero que mejor se recuerdan y dicen mucho sobre la vida de una persona. Me sorprendió muchísimo enterarme que el profesor Marcus tenía tan solo 20 años cuando se graduó de la Universidad McGill en Canadá y solo 22 años cuando recibió su título de doctor en química por parte de la misma universidad. Es un ejemplo impresionante de entrega completa al trabajo científico que continúa ya más de 50 años. Muchas veces a lo largo de nuestra colaboración con el profesor Marcus, recibía sus llamadas de California a eso de las 11 o 12 de la mañana, que corresponde a 2 o 4 de la noche en su lugar. Él estaba en su despacho trabajando como siempre en el silencio de la noche californiana, lejos de obligaciones y compromisos administrativos diarios. Recuerdo perfectamente el día 12 de octubre de 1992, cuando el Comité de Premios Nobel anunció su veredicto. Yo estaba en el Congreso de la Sociedad Electroquímica que se celebraba en Toronto, Canadá. Era lunes, primer día del Congreso. Vi a uno de mis colegas, gran experto en química cuántica, un chico joven y con ambiciones enormes. Andaba por el hall de Congreso murmurando algo a sí mismo con cara un poco perdida. Pregunté qué le pasaba a él y me contestó: ya podemos olvidarnos de obtener un premio en electroquímica en nuestra vida. El profesor Marcus acaba de ser galardonado. La sorpresa fue tanto mayor que el profesor se encontraba entre los participantes de este evento. Inmediatamente hubo una celebración espontánea con galletas, vino, parece vino fue canadiense, y posibilidad de acercarse al nuevo Premio Nobel y felicitarle por este momento histórico. Y me firmó su autógrafo en badge de Congreso. Y mantengo este badge, por supuesto. Conservaré los recuerdos de aquel tiempo para siempre, no porque utilizamos en nuestros estudios de polímeros conductores y de procesos de creación de semiconductores los conceptos introducidos por el profesor Marcus. Aún más importante que sus aplicaciones, considero su teoría como un símbolo de inconformismo científico, el coraje y la energía de una persona para trabajar incluso contra corriente, desarrollando las ideas en las que cree. Muchos de los que estamos aquí somos profesores universitarios, impartimos asignaturas muy diferentes, pero creo que tenemos un fin común en todas ellas, y la historia del profesor Marcus puede ser un buen símbolo de este fin. El de despertar en nuestros estudiantes el espíritu de creatividad, el de animarles a que se esfuercen por crear nuevas ideas y no tengan miedo de ir contra corriente, que no teman al futuro y que no esperen que alguien lo arreglará por ellos, que empiecen a pensar ya y a trabajar por su cuenta, a conseguir resultados propios y que sean capaces de defenderlos ante las críticas del mundo exterior. Me gustaría ver a mis alumnos acudiendo a esa inauguración como la clase más importante de nuestro curso. Y la conclusión de esta clase es que la ciencia no se desarrolla por la cantidad de científicos, sino por su calidad. Hay que elegir si seguir al grupo que corre en la misma dirección esperando que la verdad se encuentre por detrás de una puerta cerrada y quedarse atascado en la entrada junto con todos los demás, o bien buscar nuevas direcciones y abrir nuevas puertas, tal como hizo el profesor Marcus y como está haciendo ahora. Tengo esperanzas que este nombramiento empezará a construir un puente entre Valencia y Pasadena. Tenemos algo en común, el clima, las naranjas, jóvenes con espíritu de creatividad, profesores con dedicación. Quizá en futuro tendremos una relación provechosa entre nuestras universidades. Para terminar, quiero mencionar que el profesor Marcus está aquí con su mujer Laura, que se encuentra ahí. Y se casaron muy jóvenes y este año van a celebrar sus bodas de oro el día 29 de agosto. Señora y señor Marcus, Laura y Rudy, os deseamos una larga y feliz vida juntos.
Se va a proceder a la solemne investidura como doctor del excelentísimo señor don Rudolf Marcus.
Todos en pie.
Por la Junta de Gobierno de la Universidad Politécnica de Valencia, a propuesta del Departamento de Termodinámica Aplicada y en testimonio de reconocimiento de vuestros relevantes méritos, habéis sido nombrado doctor honoris causa. En virtud de la autoridad que me está conferida, os entrego dicho título y os impongo como símbolo del birrete laureado, venerado distintivo del alto magisterio español. Llevadlo sobre vuestra cabeza como la corona de vuestros estudios y merecimientos. Recibid el anillo que la antigüedad entregaba en esta venerada ceremonia como emblema del privilegio de firmar y sellar los dictámenes, consultas y censuras de vuestra ciencia y profesión. Así como los guantes blancos, símbolo de la pureza que deben conservar vuestras manos, unos y otros, signos también de la distinción de vuestra categoría. Porque habéis incorporado este claustro, recibid ahora en su nombre, doctor Rudolf Marcus, el abrazo de fraternidad de los que se honran y congratulan de ser vuestros hermanos y compañeros.
Tiene la palabra el excelentísimo señor doctor Rudolf Marcus.
Muy honorable señor excelentísimo rector magnífico, excelentísimos y ilustrísimos señores, profesor Dr. Bartutik, señoras magistrales, señoras y señores. Es el placer y honor para mí estar con ustedes hoy con esta ceremonia tan especial. Desearía mucho continuar mi discurso en español, pero ya se me agota mi conocimiento de vuestro impresionante idioma. Well, thank you very much for this marvelous honor, and I'm delighted to be here in Valencia and to see how wonderfully you live and how decorated everything is with these magnificent hats and gowns, which I take it you wear quite frequently. What I'd like to do today is describe some of this work that Professor Barhutic mentioned on electron transfer. I realize that this isn't the place for a chemistry lesson, and I'm not sure I could deliver it anyway. But I'd like to try to bring out a few themes that's obvious during the course of this extensive research. And these themes, I think, are common to many things in science, many developments in science. The first theme is unexpected developments. This particular work started off in a very tiny corner of chemistry, an area called isotopic exchange reactions, where just a few people were working. And eventually, due to various causes, blossomed into huge areas of research. All of that was really quite unpredicted. It started off with just trying to understand some particular processes, and then there were all these consequences. So I think that sometimes in developing research programs, one can't necessarily say, well, I'll do this and this and this and this and expect it to be great research. One has to allow, I think, for the unexpected. After all, the unexpected probably stands a better chance of being more fundamental simply because it's unexpected. The second theme I would like to try to bring out is how you can sometimes take what in a sense is a very complicated problem, and I'll be a little bit more specific about that, and introduce some simplifications and still have a realistic picture of what's going on, and perhaps in some cases develop simple equations, simple formula that experimentalists can test. They can take this formula, they can take this equation, they can maybe measure the right-hand side of the equation, maybe measure the left-hand side, and see whether in fact they are equal in experiment. So in these days when computers has played such an important role, and indeed are necessary for some problems, I think one has to recognize that sometimes there are problems in which computers might play a minor role. And the major role might be in the application of some physics, mathematics, chemistry, and develop simple equations that could be tested. I had a case of that just recently when I proposed a certain problem to a particular student, and immediately she wanted to put it on a computer, not thinking that really, with that particular problem, you could handle it analytically, and you would probably get more insight. The third theme I'd like to bring out a little is the wondrous life of interaction of theory and experiment. Experiment, of course, is the real world. And sometimes theories are developed not for any connection with the real world. And I think that that's unfortunate sometimes. But what's nice is when you have a theory which is developed for interacting with experiment, and then you find that both are enriched. That the theory sometimes suggests new experiments, and certainly the experiments can suggest all sorts of interesting applications of the theory and extensions, and that's happened a tremendous amount in this particular field of electron transfers. Another theme I'd like to bring out has been the important role of developments in technology during the past 50 years or so. You know, one can now measure the rates of chemical reactions that are more than 1,000,000 times 1,000,000 times faster than one could measure 50 years ago. One can now see individual atoms with techniques that have been developed. You know, occasionally one might see, as I saw some time ago in an article in Scientific American, a statement thinking that really all is basically known. Well, that's quite untrue, because each year, each decade seems to bring new developments. We proceed to understand more complex things. The years have seen chemistry, physics, and biology all come together in certain areas, and that understanding of biological problems is now at a much more molecular and more basic level, and there's plenty of opportunity there for chemists and for physicists. So those are some of the themes I'd like to bring out, and I'd like to just try to sketch some of the development of this field of electron transfer reactions. I don't know if we can see that. How do we turn it on? And if we want to bring it on to, is there something to adjust it? No. All right. Well, I'm sure that many of you can't see that, either because of the angle or because it's kind of small. But the main idea is that there are some reactions that were studied in the late 1940s called isotopic exchange reactions. These were reactions that were studied mainly in national laboratories that were associated with atomic energy. You may remember that after the last World War, large numbers of radioactive isotopes became available, and chemists began to use them to trace the detailed molecular mechanism of various chemical reactions by following the progress of the isotope through the various intermediates on their way to form products. And in fact, various Nobel Prizes were won in that context. Melvin Calvin, for example, or Henry Calvin, just to name two. Well, one of the uses of these isotopes was to study this simple kind of chemical reaction. This is a reaction where the products are essentially the same as the reactants, just an electron has been transferred. And by using a radioactive isotope, it became possible, through simple means, to follow the course of that reaction to measure how fast it was. That's a tiny corner of chemistry. Yet it turned out that as a class of reactions, it was the simplest class of reactions in all of chemistry. And that meant that by studying that simple class of reactions, you could learn about some factors that influence reaction rates that you couldn't learn by studying more complicated ones. I won't try to go into the technical details here, or what one learned. I've said, I think, a little bit about it in the written speech. A lot of it is said in the Nobel lecture that has come out in various journals. But the main thing is that by studying this class of reactions, one learned a lot about what affects reactions in general, simply because of the simplicity of this class. Well, based upon those studies, certain experimental facts emerged. And there was a Congress in 1952 where these facts were summarized. Several years later, I happened to see the publication of that Congress and saw a paper which tried to bring out an explanation for those results, and it involved application of physics, application of the fact that when an electron is transferred from one reactant to another, it is of such a small mass that when it jumps from one reactant to the other, the atomic nuclei, the molecules, don't have time to move during that time, and that had all sorts of major consequences when you work out the laws of physics associated with that. And this explanation, or an explanation along those lines for the existing experimental facts, how the reaction depends upon the specific types of reactants, was given by Bill Libby. Libby, who later won the Nobel Prize for a different work involving isotopes, namely the work on radiocarbon dating. And I happened to see that paper, never having heard before of those reactions, and saw this interesting application of physics based on the idea that the electron, when it jumps, the nuclei don't have time to move. And I was taken by it. But then as I looked at it further, I realized there was something that was missing, that a certain major law was being violated, even though a lot of the basic idea was correct. And so then the idea underlying the theory was to, how do you avoid that big breakdown of the basic law, but yet preserve the essence of Libby's explanation? And in relatively quick time, it became possible to reconcile the two things and get an equation which described how fast the reaction went. These reactions, or reactions involving different types of reagents, different redox systems, so to speak, and obtain equations, and equations relating the different kinds of reactions, and equations relating those reactions in solution, other kinds of reactions occurring in electrons. As I say, this is probably not the place to try to go into the technical things, but let me give you an example of the kind of simplification. You know, when chemists talk about reactions, when they talk about rates of reactions, then they think of what is happening during a chemical reaction as various bonds are stretching and others are compressing, and as molecules around them are perhaps changing their orientation in response to what's happening there. And these chemists then think of the work required to do all those things. They call it potential energy. And they plot that potential energy as a function, if they can, of all the coordinates that play a role in the reaction. Coordinates, bond lengths, coordinate, bond angle, that's coordinate, orientation of solid molecules, those are coordinates. And in fact, in these reactions and in many others, there are thousands of coordinates. And this topography, imagine that you're doing a topographical map of your lovely mountains nearby, or your flooded plains, or what have you. Imagine you're doing a topographical map, and you're plotting the contours. Well, here you have to plot it not just as a function of position on the globe, but you have to plot it as a function of thousands of coordinates. And because of all of these orientation effects of the interacting solid molecules, it turns out to be a very complicated topographical map. And if you were to do it and just look at a profile, it might look like this top curve here, which you might not be able to see too well, but the main thing is that this topography is highly uneven. And your plot is a function of thousands of coordinates. Well, it turns out, as happens in some other problems in chemistry and physics, that when you have a large number of coordinates, that under certain conditions there's a kind of simplification. I say simplification, even though teaching that simplification, the course in statistical mechanics, might take a year, 2 years, but nevertheless it is a simplification. And it turned out for this reaction, that you could take this very complicated topography, function of all these coordinates, and by appropriate application of what's called statistical mechanics, combination of statistics and physics, what have you, you could convert it to a simple plot of something which is not this potential energy, but it's related to it. A kind of statistical average over it. It's called the free energy. It's taught in all the thermodynamic courses. And you turned out that you could plot it as a function of one coordinate instead of all these thousands. Well, that was an enormous simplification. And as a result of that, even though all of these things are changing while the reaction is going on, although all of these bonds reorienting or stretching, it turned out that the equations that one obtained in this way for the reaction rate turned out to have a relatively simple form, that the rate depended exponentially on something related to how stable the products were relative to the reactants, and a certain other quantity which we could express in terms of various properties of the solvent and so on. These are relatively simple equations, and in one way or another, these simple equations are intended to apply to many of the areas in which this electron transfer field developed. Now, in these boxes, it describes the various areas. The details don't matter here. The main thing is that there are many boxes in many fields. Some of the fields deal with reactions at surfaces, electrochemical reactions at surfaces. The surfaces may be metal. They may be semiconductors. They may be composed of two liquids. All of these things have been studied. There are reactions in various protein systems, or photosynthesis, many other things. It turned out that some of the things that one learned about for this class of reactions, where it's possible to go into much detail, suggested certain equations to try for other kinds of reactions. So it's been a fairly extensive study. There were many predictions of the theory, and there were many tests of the theory. And by and large, those tests were confirmed the basic ideas of the theory. But you know, the world isn't perfect. Maybe it's perfect in Valencia, but it's not perfect elsewhere. And one of the predictions of the theory was a very unusual prediction. You know, we've heard about floods and flowing water, and you know that things go downhill. Well, this prediction was that for this class of reaction, if things were going too far downhill, in order to go from your starting point to your final point, you'd have to go uphill. It's special for this class of reaction. It was called the inverted effect. Well, we predicted that effect in a paper in 1960. Very simple consequence, actually, of those equations that I showed. And it was sufficiently unusual that experimentalist after experimentalist after experimentalist tested, tried to verify. And almost all of these attempts yielded negative results. By negative results, I mean they don't agree with theory. Then finally, 24 years after the prediction, a group of chemists at Argonne National Laboratory, where Professor Pardu's work, finally did the key experiment, and this result describes the key results. The main thing is that with most chemical reactions, this curve, where the rate is changing by many orders of magnitude, and plotted versus how downhill the reaction is, that's that minus delta G0. The conventional wisdom would be that it would go flat. The prediction was that eventually it would come down. And finally it was verified. And then, you know, sometimes when one thing is verified, many people begin to verify, and it was verified by many different laboratories. And there are reasons why there is difficulty in verifying it to begin with. Now, one of the places where it's regarded as being applicable is in the conversion of solar energy to chemical energy in photosynthesis. So I'll just say a little bit about that. As you know, in photosynthesis, the plant, or maybe it's a bacterium, the plant or the bacterium picks up the sunlight by chlorophylls. They become electronically excited, and eventually they transfer their excess energy, which is electronic, that's special, to, in the case of this particular system, to a special pair of chlorophylls. And then after that, the chemistry begins. And in this chemistry, imagine that you have a center to your photosynthetic system. This system is in a membrane. There are helices which are holding the key chemical units together, which are spanning the membrane. And the idea behind this part of photosynthesis is to transfer a charge from one side of the membrane to the other, and then use that separation charge in a well-defined molecular way to essentially harness your solar energy. As you look at the details, the trials that the electron must follow in order to successfully go from one side of the membrane to the other, it has to go in one direction. It has to do it very quickly, because there are other processes which would degrade the energy of that electron. So it has to do it very quickly. So the techniques that have been used to study this are techniques which you study reactions in a millionth of a second, for example. It wasn't until those techniques became available it became possible to study this. And eventually, as it moves along, you want to be sure that the electron doesn't go downhill back to where it started, because that would waste the energy when down. And it's believed that one of the factors that enters there is this so-called inverted effect. You know, when you look at the details of what's in the various parts of the membrane, and this question of orientation or reorientation of molecules, and this question of changing of lengths of chemical bonds, it's really impressive how nature has designed a system that actually fulfills all of those conditions that you would want. You want it to be able to go quickly without wasting a lot of the energy. And nature has found a way of doing just that. Well, this is just one example of many things that are being studied, have been studied, in this electron transfer field, and in fact in other areas of chemical reactions too, where one is learning so much more than one knew 2 decades ago. Incidentally, this whole field was given a tremendous boost forward in the mid-1980s, when a group of people from Germany found for the first time the crystal structure of this photosynthetic center. It was the first time that a membrane protein had been isolated and crystallized, and they determined the structure. You know, if you're studying chemical reactions, you rely heavily on some knowledge of chemical structure. Similarly, if you're studying biological systems in a fundamental way, whether it's this photosynthesis or whether it's moving an ion from one part of a membrane to the other side, what have you, you rely very heavily on a detailed knowledge of the positions of the individual atoms of the chemical structure. So this is an example of some of the developments of the field. I'd like to conclude this sort of brief discussion, well, it seems brief to me, with some excerpts from a Nobel poster. As you probably know, each year for each Nobel Prize, a poster is created that is intended to describe what the prize was for. And they do it for chemistry, they do it for physics, they do it for the various fields. And so, and during Nobel Week, which is a very, very active week in December, there are posters all around at various places in Sweden and Stockholm which try to describe what the various prizes were all about. And so what I've done here is to take in some excerpts from the 1992 prize in chemistry, where they try to describe how electron transfers interact with other things in life. So let's see, perhaps you can see that. But one part of the poster shows a plant, a leaf, shows photosynthesis, shows that kind of structure. It's hard to see it there, and then discusses it. So electron transfers are described there. Another part of the poster describes, remember I mentioned the simplest class of reactions in all of chemistry, the so-called isotopic exchange electron transfers. So another part of the poster tries to describe that. I think actually some of these pictures may be in the published version of the lecture. Another part of the poster tries to describe something that probably you don't experience here, but it's corrosion. That's a bicycle, corroded. Oxidation of metals. Well, oxidation of metals is a very complicated process, involves many kinds of reactions, but one of them is an electron transfer reaction. Another part of the poster describes the color of gems. I don't know if any of the ladies or any of the men here are wearing gems. You look around. Well, it turns out that the colors of some gems are really due to electron transfer reactions. I didn't know that, but I learned it from a poster. And then sometime later, I thought, well, it might be nice to see what gems are associated with what reactions. So I got a hold of a big book on gems that one of my colleagues at Caltech had written, which told all about the optical properties of gems. And I looked eagerly for these examples of electron transfer reactions. And indeed, several of the colors of gems are due to electron transfer reactions. But quite a few gems owe their color to a different source. They're transitions within the certain metal ions. They're called DD transitions. But nevertheless, there are some, so you might look at your gems in a somewhat different light anyway. Another part of the poster describes electron transfer in living matter. There's been a lot of work on electron transfer in azurin, various other things. And then finally, another part deals with this model for electron transfer. Here are these, you might not be able to see it too well, these sort of free energy parabolas that I was talking about. Here's one that describes the inverted effect. Here's one that perhaps some of you have used, these chemical light sticks that you compress, or even if you haven't, you perhaps have seen fireflies. giving off light. Well, one of the reactions involved in each of those things involves electron transfer, and that's described here. And just yesterday, I learned from one of your colleagues that another example, one not mentioned in the Nobel poster, is its current use of some electron transfer processes induced by light to try to get at certain tumors to counteract cancer in a relatively mild way. Well, it'll be interesting to see how that works out. Well, in brief, this describes some of the trends that have gone on in this field of electron transfer and how difficult it is sometimes to predict where things are going. Some time ago, I was asked to write an introductory article, a few words of introduction, to a several volume set on electron transfer, and I was asked during the next 50 years. And subject after subject after subject, the answer was no. So, although one can tell some immediate things, some things are obvious, work will go on in biology, and there'll be all sorts of interesting results, still the broad general direction might be difficult to tell. And I hope that here in Spain, as elsewhere, and in the United States, there will continue to be this support of basic research. Because as a well-known manager of research at DuPont said in the 1920s, when he started what was a very unusual program, he said, if we use up all of our basic ideas and immediate applications, and if we don't try to have basic research, hopefully developing new ones, we'll use up the storehouse. And so he devoted a certain amount of funds available to basic ideas. Well, they hired Carruthers, and one of the consequences was nylon. There are many unexpected developments that occur in basic research, and they certainly have occurred in this problem. It's been a pleasure to try to describe this work.